Hey nerds! So in the video I did a while ago in defense of fantasy, I did a brief history of Western fantasy. After I did that, I got to thinking, wouldn't it be fun to read through the entire history of the fantasy genre that I had given? Like, wouldn't it be fun to see all of the major influences on our fantasy genre? I've stated multiple times on my channel that I don't think anyone should read classics because they feel like they have to. I don't feel like anyone should have to read anything. It should be just what you enjoy. That being said, I personally really enjoy reading classics and reading things that were important at a specific point in time, particularly things that have changed our cultural vernacular, things that have had a big cultural impact. Often we will use phrases from these things without even knowing their origin, but they're all a part of our regular language. So I will give you the book list I came up with to cover the history of the fantasy genre in the West, presented in chronological order based on publication date after the jump. First, the Greek myths. Now you can hear more details about this in my previous essay, but just as a quick refresher, although the Greek myths were rooted in religious practices and, religious gods in the time that they were created, now that religion doesn't exist in the same format and no one really worships in the same way. So I feel comfortable calling these fantasy and kind of the origin of the fantasy, and many scholars agree. I think the simplest place to start with Greek myths is obviously Homer with the Iliad and the Odyssey. Now, I've read both of these as a part of my high school education already, so I kind of know their ins and outs, but definitely I feel like a lot of the main characters and stories that we know come from there, and it's kind of like the original source, and they're a great place to start. I have already read those. Now, I did do some extra research to see how I could expand my reading, and I found two interesting books. First being the Greek Mythos by Robert Graves, and then a book of the Greek plays with translations by Mary Lefkowitz and James Romm. Now, these books do seem extremely technical. They are very long, and a lot of reviews talk about them being more textbook in nature. So I'm probably not going to add these to my reading list yet, but I just wanted to give context in case you wanted to do further digging. I will also list in the description box below a very cool list I found that range from very classical Greek lit to read to a lot of different kinds of retellings, which I thought was very cool if you're interested in doing some retellings. Personally, I would say Madeline Miller is always a good place to start. The next on the list is Beowulf by Unknown. Beowulf is considered the oldest Old English poem ever written. We do not know who it is written by, and we can only estimate the dates in which it was written, which is estimated between 975 and 1025. Scholars even argue on whether this story was first started as an oral tradition and then was written down, or if it started as written word. We just don't know a lot about it. Either way, it's very old, it has a lot of fantasy elements, so it belongs on our list. I weirdly have somehow made it through my entire life without consuming a single piece of Beowulf media. I know there are a ton of different adaptations. I have seen none of them. I honestly don't even really know what it's about. And so I'm very excited to read this one. The next one is Les Morte d'Arthur by Sir Thomas Malory. We all knew I was gonna butcher the name of that. It's fine, I put it up there. King Arthur. I feel like King Arthur is a huge fantasy staple. We all know so much just in general in pop culture about King Arthur. Based on the events that happen in some of the original stories, the real King Arthur was supposed to exist probably between the 5th and 6th centuries, although most original stories seem to pinpoint later, like the 10th or 11th centuries. After a lot of research, it seems that Le Morte d'Arthur is the best kind of English translation we have of the King Arthur story, the closest to canon we're gonna get in the English language. There are definitely earlier renditions of the story that may be more accurate to like the traditional King Arthur story or narrative, but this one is extremely famous and is the one that I am personally choosing to expand my knowledge on King Arthur. Let's be honest, my current King Arthur knowledge comes from three main sources, which is Disney's The Sword and the Stone, the Camelot musical from 1967, I think, with like Richard Harris, and BBC's Merlin. So I'm excited to kind of get to some better sources there. Next on the list is fairy tales. Now, fairy tales are really hard to pin down in the timeline because fairy tales have probably been in the oral tradition for as long as we can remember. But they really came to prominence with one of the most famous fairy tale writers named Charles Perrault. I find that super interesting because I have never heard of that guy before. I've heard of the brothers Grimm or Hans Christian Andersen, which we'll talk about in a moment, but never Charles Perrault. He is known for penning or at least writing down some famous stories such as Little Red Riding Hood, Cinderella, and Sleeping Beauty. The book I've chosen to read for this one is simply titled Fairytales of Charles Perrault and seems to have a very good collection of them. I should note that Charles Perrault published most of his work in the late 1600s. Now, some of the other fairy tales I'm interested happened much later in the mid 1800s, and that's when the brothers Grimm and Hans Christian Andersen enter the picture. So I chose the complete fairy tales of the brothers Grimm, and I honestly just chose an edition that I liked the cover of. There's a million editions of this. I think any of them would work. This one is quite long, so I think it's a very thorough edition, so I'm excited to read that. And then I decided to read The Little Mermaid by Hans Christian Andersen. Now, I chose The Little Mermaid, one, because I think it's probably one of his most famous fairy tales, but also if you follow me on Instagram, you'll know I did a huge rant on my stories defending The Little Mermaid the other day, just to be random. But The Little Mermaid is close to my heart. It was my favorite Disney movie as a kid, so I'm excited to see the true story as it started out. I find it interesting because I obviously know 99% of these stories most well through the Disney adaptations, and I feel like many of us are like that today. I feel like Disney really has gotten the corner in the modern retelling of these fairy tales. I will say I did grow up also watching fairy tale theater, which did have more accurate versions of these fairy tales, so it'll be interesting to see how those compare to the original ones, which I know tend to be quite gruesome and depressing, so it'll be an interesting ride. Next up is Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. Gulliver's Travels was written in 1726 and regularly graces top 100 best books of all time or top 100 classics that you must read before you die. Interestingly enough, I don't know much about this book, although I've heard a lot about it over the years. It was an instant success when it was written and has really stuck around through the years, so I clearly think it belongs on our History of Fantasy list. I did like one thing that the author had to say about his work, which was that he wrote Gulliver's Travels to vex the world rather than divert it. So I'm interested to pick this one up. I know the least probably about this one. Next up, Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. Fantasy literature was pretty popular in the Victorian era, as you can see by the multitude of fairy tales. But another super notable work during that time was Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll, which was written in 1865. So many popular phrases come from Alice in Wonderland. For some reason, this book has really entered our cultural zeitgeist and has refused to let go. There have been so many renditions over the years, and when you think of some things like Cheshire Smile, or We're All Mad Here, or even just popularizing the coined term Wonderland, we all owe that to Lewis Carroll. Now, I actually read both Alice in Wonderland and Alice Through the Looking Glass this year as a part of my desire to read a few more classics, and I was shocked by how much I enjoyed these. Yes, they're literature that's totally suitable for children, and I expected to find it very strange and, I don't know, one of those classics that doesn't really hold up, but I found myself really liking it. It is so whimsical, so fun. I know my kids are gonna like it. I still enjoyed it. I actually just highly recommend reading it, and it definitely belongs on this list. Also, did you know that Lewis Carroll is a pen name for Charles Dodson? The more you know. I had never heard that before. The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. I mean, obviously, right? This is the book on the list. The Lord of the Rings is credited for really ushering in what we consider the modern fantasy genre. It defined the genre. It brought the genre legitimacy and taught publishers that fantasy could be a viable source of income. And the way that Tolkien wrote literally has completely changed fantasy even today. Authors borrow from it. There's that really famous quote I should look up. Something about how you either borrow from Tolkien or you purposely don't borrow from Tolkien. The quote, of course, is by the amazing Sir Terry Pratchett. J.R.R. Tolkien has become a sort of mountain, appearing in all subsequent fantasy in the way that Mount Fuji appears so often in Japanese prints. Sometimes it's big and up close, sometimes it's a shape on the horizon. Sometimes it's not there at all, which means that the artist either has made a deliberate decision against the mountain, which is interesting in itself, or is in fact standing on Mount Fuji. I mean, Tolkien fantasy is actually a phrase. It has influenced music, it has influenced pop culture. It is the thing. Now, I've already read The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, and if you want to know my opinions on them, I have an entire video about that you can watch. To make a long story short, I was blown away. I read them as adults, so pretty recently in the last few years, and I kind of had this expectation that they, again, would be a classic that was good, but we've improved on. And it still holds up for me today. I got extremely emotional reading The Return of the King. Like, they're just really good, and I highly recommend starting with The Hobbit if you haven't read it, because I think it really tells the full picture. And last but not least, The Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis and His Dark Materials by Philip Pullman. Okay, so it might seem really weird that I've put these two together on the list and also included a book series that is not in the history of fantasy, but rather written in the 90s and clearly modern fantasy, and it doesn't really go with this list at all. But just bear with me for a second. second while I talk through this. The Chronicles of Narnia were written in the 1950s and are certainly one of the more famous children's fantasy series, spawning a ton of different iterations. At the very least, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe has made an impact on fantasy. Now, I read this entire series back in high school already, and I remember particularly liking The Magician's Nephew and The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, and a couple of the other ones, but those were the two that really stood out to me. So I would say at the very least, reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is worth it for its place in fantasy history and is the one I would recommend if you do not want to read the entire series, as it tends to be the most famous and the most referenced. Although His Dark Materials is a modern fantasy, it's just one of the modern fantasies I feel like I really missed out on. One of the ones that's still regularly talked about and I feel like has really had an impact on our culture. All the other ones, the big ones, I feel like I participated in, but this one was like in the 90s and it feels weird that I just missed it. One thing I particularly remember is that it was always pitted as the atheist version of Narnia. And I used to think this was just a huge exaggeration, but during my research for this video, I found out that the author himself basically said that His Dark Materials was a response to the Christian overtones of Narnia. So I didn't really know it was like canon that this was like supposedly the atheist version of Narnia. I just honestly thought that was made up by like the Christian moms who were boycotting the movies, because I remember that very specifically, this boycott of this atheist fantasy movie. So somehow Narnia and His Dark Materials have always become linked in my brain together. Now, I personally find it really dumb to call Narnia Christian propaganda, mostly because the themes are just so overt. Like, there's no hiding this. Like, the Chronicles of Narnia are literally a Christian allegory, and I feel like at least today, there is no way you can go into Narnia not knowing its Christian undertones. So I just always find it a little silly. Personally, I could probably make a whole video on that. But similarly, I'm guessing when I read His Dark Materials, I'm gonna find the fact that people have called this atheist propaganda just as silly. So I'll be very curious to see what my opinions on that are. I do know that these books are meant for a younger audience, but I'm gonna go into it knowing that and just excited to experience them for what they are. So anyway, this just makes my personal history of fantasy list because I feel like it's something I missed that did have a big cultural impact. And so that's why I'm putting it on here. Okay, that's it. That is my history of fantasy reading list, and I have listed them all below in the description box in case anyone wants to follow along and read along with me next year when I am planning to do this. Something I meant to say at the beginning of the video is that some people feel like you cannot call something fantasy until the fantasy genre was defined, which was sometime in the 1900s. I forget, it was in my other video, and I just heartily disagree. I think the fantasy elements were there whether or not it was defined, which is why I think I am safe to say that all of these are in the fantasy genre, but I do find that interesting and I wanted to point that out. I'm gonna make another video whenever I finish reading all these books to tell you how I feel about them and how I feel like they fit in our fantasy genre as a whole. As always, I would really like to know if you've read any of these books, what you thought of them, if you think I missed any big important books on my list, what I should add, if you think a book doesn't belong on this list, all of that kind of information I'd really like to know. I'd also love to know if you would like more videos like this of reading lists. I have some ideas maybe to make like a modern fantasy one or a sci-fi one, or a particular interest to me would be one of like an Eastern historical fantasy list or a Southern historical fantasy list. I did do a little research on that. The thing I struggle with is a lot of it has not been translated to English, and unfortunately, I can only read English, so that is a barrier. So I will look more into that. If there is interest, let me know. I meant to talk about this in my main video and totally forgot, but Sarah Reeds has 2 awesome videos talking about her favorite fantasy through the decades, starting in the 1920s. It's a great video to get some other historical fantasy recs, and I'll link both of those videos in the description. As always, if you like these type of videos, please like and subscribe, and if you want to see what I'm currently reading or chat with me, the best way to do that is on Instagram at bookborn.reviews. I'll see you next time. Bye.